Okay, folks, thanks for joining us. I'm just going to say hi and introduce our excellent speaker, Theresa McComisky from Barclays, and I'm going to pass it over to Theresa to take it from here. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. As Matt said, I am Theresa McComisky, and I'm head of open source adoption at Barclays. It's a bit crazy to think that my career spans over sort of 20 years, but I thought I would, start with sort of my first memory of computers, which is back in primary school in the 1980s. Back then, the first time I saw a computer was in my classroom. And if you finished your coursework, which also had the bonus of meaning you didn't have any homework, then you were able to use the computer. The game that always sticks with me was called Granny's Garden. And the idea was then what you would do is you would be, solving puzzles to find the missing children of the Magic Kingdom. And I think the thing that got me was I just loved to solve problems. Um, you can Google it now. It's available online. It's a little bit dated, but I still would sort of recommend it. And then if I fast forward a little bit into sort of secondary school, maths was my favourite subject. Again, I think it was very much to do with the whole problem solving aspect of it, and then getting to that right answer. I've always found that that is an inherent reward. And it wasn't just maths. When I think to back to my English at school, I really enjoyed reading sort of particularly fantasy novels, and I remember choosing to study Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings for my higher dissertation. This was a long time before the films, and I still believe that your imagination is a lot richer than perhaps what you can see as a film. I also studied computing at standard grade and also at higher. And when I think back now, in my higher class, there was only 5 of us and I was the only girl. At the time, I didn't really think much, of this. And it's only really as my career has progressed, I've started to realize the importance of, balance and, having different points of view. As women, as females, we absolutely bring, maybe a different dimension to problem solving. And when you don't get, that sort of, balance, then, there's historic examples of solutions or products being, designed from a single point of view that perhaps don't really hit their target audience. And Barclays and all companies now understand and encourage the benefits of having a sort of diverse mix of people and views. And also that perhaps sometimes we might think differently. I find myself sometimes that I maybe need a little bit more encouragement to certainly to believe in myself. And I mentor a number of really smart female technologists from a graduate level through to a lot more experienced. And I would definitely say that there's a bit of a common theme where that you really want to try to get them to believe in themselves. So again, if I start to think as I went towards like sort of university, as I said, maths was my favourite subject, and that's what I chose to study when I went to Glasgow University. So in my first year, I studied maths, philosophy, and astronomy, which is just really hard physics. And then in my second year, I took a module in computing and I found that I really enjoyed it. And then hence, chose to sort of switch the focus of my degree from maths, to software engineering. I think it's really important to try new things, and also that it's okay, to change your mind. You certainly, it's a, it's a long, career, and I think it's really important to find something, that you enjoy. The main takeaways that when I think back from my course was that from a software engineering perspective is you taught the basics, right? So it's almost, what is an algorithm, what is an array, what is a hash map? These things are, somewhat constant because we were also taught to how to learn a language, because things change all the time. back in the sort of mid 90s, Java was a new language, and it was very much, cool. And I was very, keen and eager to work and learn, in Java. I also remember learning how to work as a team. In our third year, we had a group project, and my team, together, we built a sort of simple operating system. We didn't get it quite sort of finished, but again, I still have lots of good memories and learnings of that time. And then finally, this real emphasis even then on, collaboration and learning. In my fourth year, my supervisor was working with Sun Microsystems, where, the creative force behind Java at that time. And, there's a PhD student, working on garbage collection, which is really, how do you stop, your computer running out of memory and crashing? So again, early on, this theme of learning, and working, together, is something that's, I think, very much central, to computing science. Also, if I, reflect now, by my third year, we were a class of, 45, of which 5 were female. Again, at the time, you do look back and saying, that whole idea of how do you work on the importance of encouraging and working with a sort of more, balanced and, diverse sort of talent pool. And as I was starting to look forward to my first role out of university, I'd caught the coding bug. I very much, wanted to have, a role that meant I could code and learn, and ideally in the languages that I wanted to use. I was also keen to have a role that paid. That extra time at university, well, it was, the right thing to do. Also meant that I was keen to get a salary, and I think, the appetite for, computing science, and technologists is like simply growing. So it's definitely, an avenue to look at, where you have longevity, round about your career. But back then, well over 20 years ago, we didn't have Google. And so when I remember my first role, when you were learning new things, you would be buying books, and reading the textbooks, or, querying some of the installed, manuals that were on the server. Or again, you very much relying, on your team to teach you and to learn from. I also learned a lot about the electricity industry, as the company that I worked for developed software that monitored the electricity flow around the network, and it was used by all the UK power companies. They also had a system called Trouble Call, which was the software that tracked, incidents when people phoned in because they had no power to their homes. As my career progressed, I started to find out the types of things that I liked doing, and also what I was good at. So for example, I'm definitely not, a UI developer. It's just perhaps, some of that creative skill. It's just not something that I have an inherently good at. But what I really enjoyed doing was like sort of writing, back end type logic, and computer to computer comms. So very much that whole side of it was where my heart lie. I also learned about investment banking because this time I've moved roles, and as I spent time, working on a fixed income trading, platform, you can't really, solve problems unless you really understand, the industry that you work in. So I did start to learn a lot about, securities at that point in time. And it's also really important to understand your users. So in that case, the users were, the traders of the platforms, and how they wanted the system to work. So from their perspective, a UI was full of lots of shortcuts for speed that you would learn, because that was much more important to them to having a really pretty and intuitive layout. Very early on, I also realized that data is like super important. it drives decision making, and poor quality data means poor quality or wrong decisions that can have a real impact on people's lives. And now with, like, the advent of, large scale data processing, machine learning and data scientists, is really one of the most, exciting areas to be involved in, from, a computing perspective. And it really, plays on, sort of maths or physics skills that you have. And again, a lot of the languages, that have been sort of designed to work in this type of space, such as Python, you know, are quite intuitive, and are, have a really friendly and enthusiastic sort of developer, community, because, they really, bought in, and they all, want to try and improve and do more together. And I suppose that starts to, lead me on to, where I am now in my current role as, like, head of, open source adoption. Overall, I think it's a really bright and exciting, time to be involved in computing. Code is actually really cool. Open source has changed the way that we develop software. There's this recognition that, the developer isn't just sitting in the corner, perhaps, following instructions. They're very much involved in, setting the direction. It's about, solving problems and taking things in a way that they think that they should be taking. So that means there's lots of, collaborative working, there's lots of passion and enthusiasm. And, it's just, some of the sort of biggest changes I've seen over, my sort of 20 years. And, coupled just with this idea of the pace of change, now with the move to cloud, and as I said, the whole open source network, it really is quite a sort of different place to be. But it's not just finance. Every industry now relies on technology in order to be, successful. And you always marry, the technical skills with understanding the business side of it to be successful. I also think it's an incredibly flexible career option. Um, Given a lot of the changes that have happened over the last year, there's a big shift to, working from home, which was, already, quite a good, an easy thing to do, when you work in, sort of computing, and development. And it's a great option, for, that sort of flexible, side of it as well. The way that you work within your team, how you're sort of structured, means that you don't have to work 9 to 5. It's definitely possible to, split your week, or, shift that up and down as, your life changes with you. And after 20 years, I still feel, that it's a really sort of fresh and exciting industry to work in. And I certainly still feel that every day is a school day.
Thank you, Theresa. That was excellent. I really enjoyed that. Thank you. Got a couple of questions for you, if that's all right.
Sure.
You mentioned how coding isn't about sitting alone typing away. It's much more of a team effort, I think. So maybe you could tell me about a typical day for a developer.
Yeah, certainly. So what I might try and do is talk you through. So I have a grad from computing, from Glasgow University, software engineering, who joined my team, a few months ago. So perhaps I'll talk a little bit about, how we sort of work together. So first thing, every day, we'll have a catch up or a scrum meeting, so that it means that it's really important, now that we're all sort of working from home, so that we can just start to talk about, some of the things that happened yesterday, some of the things that we want to try and like do today, and is there any sort of help or problems that we need to sort of try and work through. And then, typically, what would then happen at the moment is there would be, you know, as we start to work out what needs to be done, there'll be calls arranged, with some of the other, sort of developers that we're working with, who are, sort of spread across, we're working with teams out in India and Pune, and, working, with teams in Glasgow. So there's a lot of like, can you explain to me how, this works? So like sort of screen sharing, almost like pair programming, going on to then start to, share the knowledge, and, also also then sort of the other way around as we start to improve and sort of make things better. So definitely you always see that even from a coding perspective, there's a lot involved in, learning and sharing that information. And then when you've made, some sort of changes, it's really important that you also, follow up on some of the documentation angles of it as well, because it's all about once you've learned something, you want some, other people to be able to learn and come along and, learn from it and then build on it. Or we keep building and building and building on what's already sort of been done. A term you'll hear a lot is like, no one wants to reinvent the wheel anymore, right? So let's make sure that we're always doing something new. And then other common things that we'll do is we have, because we are doing open source adoption across like the organization, we'll quite often have a team who are interested and want to find out more, and then we can sit down and help them all become sort of part of what we're doing.
Brilliant, thanks. That's so yeah, it's much more than people think if they're not familiar. It's much more varied and much more social, actually, I think.
Indeed.
What about the sort of career options? So you mentioned that there are lots of different things you can do, and there's the opportunity maybe to change careers. What are the sort of career choices open to people at the moment?
Well, it's such, a vast and growing field. I think, you don't necessarily sort of think about it. I've maybe already sort of touched on, the whole data, aspect of it. We're capture every, system, even your car or your phone or everyone else, we're capturing so much information. So just being able to, make sense and make better, decisions, the whole data science and, within, a finance organization, these we'll call quants, that help us start to make decisions. Definitely a huge, route, and it certainly blurs the line between technology and, a lot of, the other teams within an organization as well. Cyber is another great growing area as we all become like more connected. Not there's always like a few nefarious individuals out there who perhaps, don't, have their own best interests at heart. So, being able to think and stay one step ahead, is a really like sort of fast moving, area. And we see a lot of interest in that sort of side, of it. Cloud, computing, again, huge change to, the sort of industry, a completely different way of, thinking, where you don't have to manage servers or kit, all these things are, auto provisioned on your behalf. So this idea that you move to like a services type, culture, and then you can build solutions and platforms on top of that. Again, very different, way of thinking. And the one I mentioned earlier, the whole UI design, if you look at things like such as, your iPhone, the whole sort of design angle skill of this, to make technology like super accessible so that it's part of, everyday life is a skill I appreciate, but I don't have. But, certainly that, that you're much more, creative side of the world. And I'm probably just tip of the iceberg, there, AI, you can just imagine everything when I talked about, fantasy and science fiction that I used to read, when I was a teenager, a lot of these things are all starting to, turn into reality.
Yeah. Another thing you touched upon in terms of career was that you wanted to get paid a decent wage, and I think it can still be a rewarding, let's say, a rewarding career for young women. Would you say?
Absolutely. As I said, I definitely don't regret any of the decisions I made at university to sort of stretch it out to find something I enjoy doing. But it does mean I was a poor student, by the end. And even if you look now, every business is effectively some form of technology company underneath the hood. And if you're a technology company, that then you means that you need, computer science, software engineering, graduates to help, turn the vision and the excitement that people want to do, into a reality. So it's very much that any company, any walk of life, technologists and developers are very much, in demand.
Okay, and this is something we chatted about before, so I hope you don't mind me bringing it up. But there's this sense from some quarters that you can be in tech but not be a developer or not understand development. So you not have earned your stripes as a programmer, as it were. What do you think of that?
So I think that's absolutely true. I mean, it is, a vast field, but personally, for me, I think it is really important almost to, you know, understand, what a rewarding career being, a developer, is. You talked a lot about, the fact that you can solve the problem yourself, you can write the code, I've always found that's a really great empowering, thing to be able to do. And then once you have those skills and you understand how it works, you don't have to be the greatest programmer in the world, but ultimately, if you've done it yourself, right, you will have learned and understood. Then that means, for me, the world is, your oyster. Then that means you might be more focused on some of the business aspects. You want to become, a data analyst, but having that, or a business analyst, or maybe a project manager. It's a case of, but you understand how it works. You understand, those fundamentals of what is the art of the possible, in a lot of ways. And I think if you look at a lot of the, the really successful companies that you see today, your Facebooks, Googles, Amazon, Microsoft, the list is endless. A lot of the things have got in common is, they were originally started by, developers, by, the techies, because part of was, they had this idea, but they also could understand what was possible or start to push the envelope in what was possible. And I think that's a big part of, why they are, so successful and can change, the industry is they understand the art of the possible, or can dream about how you can start to, evolve it to make it happen.
Yeah, brilliant. There was a comment you made about how you had learned how to learn a language, if you like, which is interesting because the course I'm going to be teaching in a couple of weeks is called How to Learn a Language, and it's to try and instill those skills in people. So do you feel, you said Java was cool in the 90s? I remember that as well. I mean, it's still cool, right? But it was very much the thing. I was taught, I think, Pascal and then Ada 95, but I'm sure you had a similar sort of experience. Has that set you up then? What you learned back then 20 years ago, has that set you up for your career now still?
It has, definitely. So that idea of that, this isn't a static, sort of profession. No professions are, but perhaps, in some ways, computing does move, very fast. This idea that if you have the good grounding, you have that, foundation, then it's a case of, you need to then be able to apply that. So, when I was starting out, the first thing you always want to do is your hello world, example. It's that, first thing of how you start to learn a language. So you learn hello world and what it means, this idea that you have to be able to, one, get something to compile. You need to be able to understand how to output, something to whatever, the display is at that point in time. So, it's you understand those sort of foundational type concepts, and then you have to then say, how do I work out how to do that based on, whatever the language is, or, perhaps whatever the infrastructure, I currently have, to work with. So it's really, sort of simple techniques is that grounding, like, can I compile it? Yes. Can I get it to say hello to me? Right. Okay, I can do this. Right. Everything else is, that's almost the hard part. And everything after that is just, okay, well, so I want to do X, and I want to understand how I can do Y. And I do a little bit more reading, and I find out that, in this new world, that people are doing really cool things with here, and they've already built this, so I don't even have to do that. So that means I can then work on doing the next thing that's in my imagination, all the time. So, that whole building of it is definitely is I think what it's all about. So you should never be afraid of change, and in fact you should always embrace it.
Well, that leads nicely into my next question, because I know that part of your role is to head up open source adoption at the bank. To my mind, that seems like a brave new world in some ways for the corporate world. But I think it probably brings in this idea of community and collaboration that you were talking about earlier. Could you maybe talk a little bit about the advantages of bringing open source into business?
So it's a lot of like what what you said there. So it's there's lots of different ways you could do it. So one is this idea that, historically, if you were restrained to some vendor, products, then that limits your choice for being able to solve like some of the problems that are there. And this whole idea that from an open source perspective, that you can look at the code and then learn and improve something all the time, really is another way of empowering the developers and getting them to work together, as you said, this whole sort of sense of community. So it's pretty much a de facto that you consume open source, but very much making sure, even as as a large organization, that we start to sort of give back and contribute back to the community, is a way that a lot of organizations are working, because that means that we can all do more things. Again, back to this whole don't reinvent the wheel. If we work together, we can do more, smarter and faster. And also it's just a good way to work. There's a real feel good factor, which maybe seems strange working in a corporate environment, about giving back and improving and being able to make something better, and then also then sharing it with other people, either inside Barclays or in the wider community.
Brilliant. We're almost at time, but I've got a couple of slightly more fun questions. You mentioned Granny's Garden, which I think was a personal favorite of mine as well. I remember playing it on the BBC at school. Do you think playing games was an influence on you at all? Was that one of the things that made you interested in computers, or was it just by the by?
Um, it certainly sparked an interest. I think I was quite competitive, so one of those sort of, I love, as I said, this idea of, you're faced with a problem, right?
Mm.
And you can solve it, and you're working through it. So that was certainly, what I really enjoyed. Back then you used to have like role play books, whether it's you would go through a page and then you had to step to another one, and sometimes you might, you know maybe not,
Yeah,
maybe cheat. We don't want to say cheat, but it was there, but you couldn't really do that, on screen. So you were pitting your wits, and it was a really enjoyable way to, sort of, to do it. So it definitely sparked an interest, and that was back in primary school, and the 80s. Again, I'm not sure how much, we do that in like schools now, but we should definitely start to do it, in primary school.
definitely. Yeah, and for the record, that is cheating if you're looking ahead in your choose your own adventure books, Theresa. Final question, actually, also about books. Do you still read fantasy? Do you still read Tolkien or any sci-fi, maybe?
Um, I do. I think maybe a little bit sadly, when I got into my sort of 20s, I didn't start to read as much fantasy, probably more science fiction, now than that I used to. And possibly if you're looking at science fiction, say from 20, 30 years ago, it's quite interesting to see how many of like the predictions or some of the ideas have come true. But the Hobbit is my favorite book, and Riddles in the Dark has to be my all-time favorite chapter. Again, this idea of you're faced with a problem, and it's like,
Mm-hmm.
can you guess what the answer
Right.
to the riddle will be. I read them so many times, as a teenager, over and over again.
Brilliant.
Timeless, I think.
Yeah, timeless. And you found the problem solving in it, of course. Spoken like a true computer scientist. Well, that's us exactly on time. So I'd like to wrap it up there, but thank you so much. I think that was really interesting. Thanks, Theresa.
Okay, thanks for
All
having
right.
me.
All right, folks. I'm going to wrap this up in a second. You can find out more events at ada.scot/events. But thanks for joining us today. And this will be made available online, so you can catch up on it later and share it too. So thanks again, Theresa.